what's going on then? So Clement VII tries to, by force of arms, physically capture Rome and drive his rival out, or maybe take him prisoner. And of course that would, in a manner of speaking, have ended the problem. Louis, Duke of Anjou, crosses into Italy with the finest army the world has seen, says Hughes, and it's 40,000 men strong, and it looks like Urban VI is on the ropes, and to cut a long story short, the army, it has some initial success, but it gets bogged down and eventually retires from Italy, its numbers dwindling, so that doesn't work. And then Clement VII tries to kind of get another army together, but he has his own problems at home, particularly wrangling with the King of France. It's tempting to think that all the way through the Avignon Papacy, because the popes are in Avignon, that they are kind of the puppets of the French king. And I think really that's not true. Nonetheless, you can see there's always going to be a temptation there. And there are the beginnings of Gallicanism going on. And there is this constant struggle between the Pope and the king. It's not just France that it's limited to. You saw a similar thing in England with Thomas à Becket. But that's happening in France, and yeah, there are each pope. Remember, he's pope of about half of Europe, and he has to deal with the sort of things that a pope would normally have to deal with. He can't simply focus the whole time on trying to kill or kidnap his rival. Right, let's go on. So what's the next thing? There we go. So Rome, yes, Urban the Sixth has his own problems as well, and it's the same old, same old. It's different states in Italy trying to steal bits of the papal states and various wars, and he's allying himself with one state in order to defeat another one. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, which is fine until that ally of yours then turns on you. So that continues. He has his own problems which occupy him. So both Urban VI and Clement VII are kind of tied up with their own problems, each in their own sphere. I mentioned that they have successors elected when they die. Boniface IX succeeds Urban VI in 1389, and 5 years later, Pedro de Luna becomes Benedict XIII and succeeds Clement VII. And I mentioned the University of Paris and the various schemes for ending the schism. There's a lot of interest in this. It's very widespread, and there's a lot of enthusiasm for various schemes. The upshot of that is each of these conclaves, the cardinals, first of all, there's a lot of pressure on them from everybody else. What are you going to do to end the schism? And they all sort of go into the conclaves making solemn oaths. If I'm elected Pope, I promise my first priority will be to end the schism. And with each conclave, that becomes more the case. They're making, in the end, blood-curdling oaths. I will, even if I'm elected Pope, I will resign the papacy if that will help end the schism. They all make that in front of everybody. You'll notice in passing, we know an awful lot about what goes on in conclaves. I think the laws regarding the secrecy must have only been brought in later on. What we think of as how a papal conclave works, it was only developed over time. Cardinals have only existed for maybe 300 years by this point. They are a late 11th century thing. So yeah. Okay, let's go on. So these are the Roman popes then. So we have, there we go, that's them and their coat of arms. Boniface IX, who reigns for another, 13 years is that? By the way, notice that the scheme about waiting for each pope to die, that really wouldn't have worked, because you'd be waiting 11 years for Urban to die and another 13 years for his successor to die. Okay, Innocent VII, who doesn't reign very long, he's only pope for 2 years, and Gregory XII, that's him down there, he becomes pope in 1406, and he remains pope until either the Council of Pisa or the Council of Constance. And I will ask your opinion about when later on. You'll see what I mean. He's pope until either 1409 or 1415. Now, Gregory XII in particular, as I say, made this solemn oath in front of everybody and made a big point of it while he was a cardinal, as they all did. My priority will be ending the schism. If I'm elected Pope, I will do everything I can to resolve the schism. I will even resign, I will abdicate the papacy, if that will help. And then when he's elected Pope, of course, it's difficult to hold somebody to that kind of an oath once he's been elected. But when he's elected Pope, he goes out of his way to reaffirm the oath that he's just made. And this causes a huge amount of enthusiasm. The enthusiasm sort of dies down because as the years go by, when you're into the early 1400s, people realise this is not coming to an end. We are now on the 4th Roman Pope since this began. We're still only on the 2nd Avignon Pope because Pedro de Luna lives to a ripe old age. He just goes on and on and on. He dies finally well into his 90s. But we're on the 4th Roman Pope. And so, and none of these schemes seem to work. Nobody seems to be really sure how exactly do you call a council where it is one council for everybody when it really, normally it would be a pope who calls a council. You're only going to end up with 2 popes, 2 college of cardinals. You're going to end up with 2 councils that don't agree with each other. So when Gregory XII is elected, it really breathes new life into the movement to end the schism, and people from the other side, from the Avignon obedience and the University of Paris, the French king, all of them are very enthusiastic, and so it puts pressure on Benedict XIII. Look how full of goodwill this new Pope in Rome is. All it takes is for you to be equally willing, and we can maybe solve it. Okay, next. So, there we go. Yeah. This is, I want to emphasize this, Gregory XII makes a point of saying, I will resign the papacy if it will help. Okay, on we go. Right. Yeah. So yes, if you are one of the 2 popes, the other thing is, it helps you to be seen to be the good guy. There's a lot of kind of politicking going on, and Gregory XII benefits from the enthusiasm. Benedict XIII can't afford to alienate his supporters, so of course he has to say that he's willing too. Now Benedict XIII, I didn't mention this and I should have mentioned it in passing, Clement VII gets into this sort of tussle with the King of France. Benedict XIII inherits that, and he really is not giving in. In some ways you have to admire him. He did a lot to defend the rights of the papacy against the French king. The irony being, he probably wasn't Pope. But he's very subtle. He was a canon lawyer. I think he was a doctor of canon law at the University of Montpellier when Gregory XI had made him a cardinal. So he has a very sort of subtle mind. He's very good at weaving in and out and tripping people up and that kind of thing. And it's he's a very frustrating guy to deal with. At one point, the King of France literally lays siege to Avignon, and that's it. The Pope is now effectively a prisoner in the papal palace of Avignon, and he manages to escape. He manages to escape, and he flees to Perpignan, which today is in the bottom left corner of France, but in those days it belonged to the Kingdom of Aragon, and the King of Aragon gives him kind of political sanctuary. At another point, I think over the same wrangling with the King of France, a lot of the French cardinals side with the King of France. So they sort of, they leave the papal palace of Avignon and they send word to Benedict XIII, we are withdrawing our obedience from you. So you have a sort of schism within a schism going on there. Okay. So he's now no longer in Avignon, he's in Perpignan. The scheme is hatched that they're going to get the 2 popes to meet, because remember, if they're both going to resign, they have to resign simultaneously, and the only really practical way to do that is they have to see each other face to face in person and agree to the resignation scheme. The way that a lot of diplomacy is conducted is by ambassadors, envoys, but it takes forever to travel anywhere in those days. You must remember that. So you don't want to resign and then have to wait for months till the ambassadors come back and tell you your rival has resigned. So it really has to be done face to face. Yeah. Okay, next. So there's Marseille. The meeting never took place. Benedict XIII gets as far as Marseille, and Gregory XII is meant to come up from Rome, which isn't on this map, and they're going to meet in Savona, which is to the west of Genoa. You'll see there, it's kind of on the border. It's Italy, but it's almost France. Gregory XII's relatives prevail on him because they don't want him to stop being Pope, because then they are no longer the relatives of the Pope. And eventually he's weak and he gives in. So he breaks his word and goes back on it. And it's very, very frustrating. It's in fact, the envoys are from the King of France, who by this point has declared that France is now neutral and non-aligned. As in, we're not officially supporting either candidate. We are of the party that wants to get them together and both resign. So they were supposed to meet at Savona. Benedict XIII didn't really want to do it either, but he had to pretend that he did so that he can look like the good guy, and he's probably secretly delighted when he hears that Gregory XII is now saying no, because he can make a big show of, well, I'm here, where's he? I was willing to do it. Oh, well, I guess that's too bad. It's not going to happen now. Right. At this point, I am actually going to quote from Hughes, I think. Let's go on. There we go. Yeah. Yes, Benedict XIII does end up going to Savona. And he realises that his rival isn't going there, so he makes a big thing of going there and saying, well, I'm here. Where's he? Okay, next. Okay, this is from A History of the Church by Father Philip Hughes. Finally, on the 10th of May, 1407, Benedict received the French king's envoys, and in a most eloquent speech, he accepted their point of view wholeheartedly. He says, yes, I agree with you about the resignation scheme. But when the next day the ambassadors begged him to publish his concessions in a bull, all the old trouble began anew. For a week the two parties wrestled, but without any result. Benedict refused absolutely to declare publicly that he too was willing to resign if Gregory would resign. So he says yes, and when they say, can we have that in writing? He says, have what in writing? I never agree to anything. He's very slippery. We know now that he was moreover at this very time preparing an elaborate sentence of excommunication for all who had urged this resignation scheme. He's secretly preparing that. And the ambassadors knew then that in order to resist any repetition of the siege of 1398, he was gathering men and arms secretly. Okay? So he's a slippery customer. Yes?
Would it have been the duty of the king at that time to force the Pope to go to the meeting?
Yeah. I'm not sure, but in any case, that might cause its own problems, because if you have a pope who resigns literally under threat of arms, what's going to happen afterwards, given what we saw about the conclave of 1378? The minute he's no longer under an armed guard, he's going to say, well, my resignation doesn't count because it was done under threat. Do you see the problem? Yeah. Okay, next. So the French embassy, leaving two of its members in Marseille with Benedict XIII to keep watch on Benedict, now made its way to Rome. But by the time Rome was reached, 18th of July 1407, a great change had come over Gregory XII. His family had worked him round to cling to the papacy. They had also infected the old man with the idea, that Benedict planned to kidnap him when the two met. And moreover, the Roman Pope's chief political supporter, Ladislaus, King of Naples, was strongly opposed to the plan of any meeting between the popes. From now on, Gregory's court is the scene of intrigues as complicated and obscure as any of Peter de Luna's feats. One series of these, it seems, was a hidden understanding with Ladislaus, in virtue of which the king attacked Rome and so provided Gregory with the best of reasons for not leaving the papal state. Ladislaus is the successor to Joanna. He's the king of Naples. So it seems Pope Gregory XII said to him, look, can you pretend to attack Rome, and that will give me an excuse as to why I can't leave. After nearly 3 weeks of sterile argument, the French at last left Rome, certain that Gregory would now prove a second Peter de Luna, but certain also of this, excuse me, that he had lost the confidence of his own cardinals. For the Roman cardinals had privately assured them that whatever Gregory did, they at least would go to Savona, and that should Gregory die, they would not give him a successor. So he's not agreed to the resignation scheme, he's changed his mind at the last minute, but he's alienated all his own cardinals by doing that, and they say, well, we're going without him, and they even tell that to the French envoys. And if he dies, we're not going to have another conclave. We are absolutely fed up of the schism being perpetuated to satisfy the ego of whoever the guy in the seat happens to be. Yeah. Okay. So that's what's going on. Right, next. So things are beginning to move. And what happens is they meet. But they meet at Pisa, not Savona. And what comes out of that is the Council of Pisa. This is the Cathedral of Pisa. And you can see in the background, just behind it, what is that there? That's the famous Leaning Tower, which it turns out is a bell tower. I didn't realise that. I always wondered what the point of it was. It's just a standalone bell tower. There is also a standalone baptistry nearby. Inside the cathedral will be held the Council of Pisa. So cardinals and bishops from both sides end up abandoning each pope. Benedict XIII's cardinals abandon him, and they join Gregory XII's cardinals at Pisa. An interesting development. So something maybe is now going to happen. Okay. Remember that one of the ideas from the University of Paris was the idea of having a council as a means of resolving the split. So that's looking like what's going to happen. Not long before that, it looked like it would be the resignation scheme. Now it looks like it's kind of naturally turned into a council to solve the split. Okay, and the fact that they're now kings and princes are beginning to become fed up with it as well, that also helps. It helps if you have the King of France on your side. Okay, next. Okay, so the Council of Pisa, again, it really could have a talk in its own right. It's fascinating. What is it? Is it even a council? Well, I'll ask you your opinion in a moment. So it wasn't called by a pope. There are two popes, and it's not called by either of them. And in fact, it's called very much in defiance of each of them. But it was attended by 4 patriarchs, 22 cardinals, 80 bishops in person, and another 100 by proxy, which was a fairly common thing in those days. 87 abbots, that is mostly Benedictine and Cistercian. 41 superiors of non-monastic orders. So, for instance, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, send their superiors general there. More than 300 university doctors of theology and canon law, excuse me, and ambassadors representing 17 different princes and kings. And it's all presided over by Guy de Maillesec, who is one of the list of cardinals I showed you in 1378, that original conclave. He's now the senior one alive. There are still 1 or 2 of them alive. He's the senior one. Okay? So they get together, they have this council, they have a sort of solemn high mass of the Holy Ghost, they officially open the council, and next, here we go, right, that's Pisa from another angle, and you can sort of see the baptistry in the background. What happens is in the first couple of sessions, March to April of 1409, they go through this ritual of asking where's the Pope, effectively. The senior cardinal who's presiding over the meeting, they read out this document in Latin and they say, you know, is Pedro de Luna, known as Benedict XIII, present? And they let the silence speak for itself. Are any of his representatives present? And very theatrically, they let the silence speak for itself. And the same with Gregory XII. They do that again and again and again, all the way up until April. And then at the end of April, they read out this document in Latin, charging each of them with contumacy and a whole load of other charges as well. So they're going to now charge these two popes, and in fact, they're going to depose them. Okay? So they there are 38 charges, and the Council of Pisa appoints a commission to examine witnesses, which takes until the 5th of June. They're gathering evidence, they're hearing arguments, etc. And then they find them guilty, and the council deposes Gregory XII, and it deposes Benedict XIII. Next. There we go. So, Benedict XIII and Gregory XII are recognised as schismatics, the approvers and makers of schism, notorious heretics, guilty of perjury and violation of solemn promises, and openly scandalising the universal church. In consequence, they are declared unworthy of the supreme pontificate and are ipso facto deposed from their functions and dignities and even driven out of the church. It is forbidden to them henceforward to consider themselves to be supreme pontiffs, and all proceedings and promotions made by them are annulled. The Holy See is declared vacant, and the faithful are set free from their promise of obedience, says the Council of Pisa. This is read out by the Patriarch of Alexandria. Very interesting. Can a council that hasn't been called by a pope depose a pope? If the answer is yes, then at this point the see is vacant, and Gregory XII, you'll remember, his papacy lasts 1406 to 1409. Okay, the next thing, and you can see this coming, is there's no pope. So what do we do about that? We hold a conclave and we elect a pope. So they hold a conclave and they elect a pope. And it's not, as is commonly believed, done on the floor of the council. It's not all the council fathers who elect the pope. It's the 22 cardinals who were mentioned earlier on. So they hold the conclave nearby, and they do it properly. They follow all the regulations. The mayor of Pisa turns up with his officers, and they swear their solemn oaths in front of the council fathers that they're going to use their soldiers to physically protect the conclave. And the cardinals go into conclave. Next slide. So there's a little bit of discussion about how are we going to do this? Because the problem is this: unless you give everybody a pope who is indisputably the pope, you're just going to make matters worse, aren't you? And at this point, I'd say the vast, vast majority of Europe, of the Christian world, is behind the Council of Pisa. Gregory XII has very few supporters. Benedict XIII has a few, but not many. Almost anyone who's anyone is backing Pisa. But they're trying to anticipate problems that may arise in the future. So which cardinals are real cardinals? Let's just avoid that problem and say that both lots of cardinals, Benedict XIII's cardinals, the Avignon cardinals, and the Roman cardinals, they can get together and they are the college. We'll kind of pretend, we'll mutually recognize each other's cardinals, which doesn't really make sense if you think about it, but it's the only way out of that problem. They do this electoral promise again, if I am elected, etc., and it's read out in front of the whole council. 24 cardinals enter a specially prepared conclave protected by local troops, and they, at one point they say, really we want a unanimous election. Because the problem is, if it's just about somebody gets enough votes, 2/3, what happens due to the fact that half of the cardinals are Avignon cardinals and half are Roman cardinals? But then you see there's other problems. Suppose, okay, fine, a unanimous election would be nice, but suppose there's just one cardinal holding out, keeping it from being unanimous. What happens if the conclave drags on and on and on? People on the outside don't know what's going on in a conclave. Once they're locked in, that's it. So there's going to be all kinds of politicking on the outside, and if it goes on too long, the Council of Pisa might break up, people might get bored and go home. Or they might start fighting each other. Who knows what's going to happen? So on the other hand, we don't want it to go on too long. So what do we do if it's not unanimous? Well, we need 2/3 majority, but it has to be also 2/3 of the Roman cardinals and 2/3 of the Avignon cardinals. And if you don't have 2/3 of each, it doesn't count either. And they all kind of agree to that when they go in there. Just so that later on, if you have 2/3 overall, but it's mostly Roman ones and not Avignon ones, the Avignon people can't say, well, it wasn't really our Pope. Okay? Does that sort of make sense? Yes? Okay, on we go. Right. Pietro Filargo, OFM. He's a Franciscan, and he's elected, takes the name Alexander V. And very influential in his election is a character who we will become more and more familiar with, an Italian cardinal, one of Gregory XII's cardinals, called Baldassare Cossa. Alexander V, he lives less than a year. There's a huge amount of rejoicing when he's elected, and people are convinced the Western Schism is over. We now have a pope that everybody recognises. Cardinals from each side have elected him. The whole world, all of these Christian kings and princes are behind him, and then he dies. But the Council of Pisa is still going on. So they just have another conclave at Pisa, and they elect a successor, and it's Baldassare Cossa, who takes the name John the 23rd. And I made a point of saying on that slide there, yeah, he enjoys greater, more widespread support than any other pope since Gregory XI died. So the world is at his feet, so to speak, but all is not quite as it seems. Next. Okay. What has become of Gregory XII and Benedict XIII? Clearly they are not at Pisa, even though their cardinals are. So Benedict XIII goes back to Perpignan, where he's safe, and he calls his own council, and so the Council of Perpignan takes place. Now, what's surprising is that actually some people do show up. He does have a few bishops and abbots and whatnot. Not many, but more than none at all. Mostly Spanish, and Scotland is still with him at this point as well. Gregory XII had, as part of his big, I will end the schism by whatever means necessary, he also had made an oath, I forgot to mention, that he wouldn't make any new cardinals. But he now breaks that oath and goes and makes, because his cardinals have all abandoned him, he breaks his oath on that front as well and goes and makes a whole new load of cardinals. And he calls his own council, which is going to convene at Cividale del Friuli, which is right up in the very top right corner of Italy. It's almost in, I think, Slovenia. It's right up at the top. It's about 70 miles northeast of Venice. And it's an embarrassment. He calls this council and nobody shows up. Nobody at all. They can't even start the council because there's no one there. So they send out letters again and they manage to get a few people to show up and they get the council going. What's interesting about these two councils, I think I have a map on the next thing. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, let's have a look. So there's Perpignan, 1408, and June 1409, Cividale del Friuli, which is meant to start on the Feast of Corpus Christi, 1409, June 1409. Benedict XIII finds very little help or comfort from the Council of Perpignan because even though there are a fair few number, nothing at all like the numbers that show up to Pisa, but he does have supporters at the Council of Perpignan. They recognise him as Pope, but they're not happy with him, and effectively his own council tells him, oi, knock it off. You're getting in the way here of something that otherwise would be really good. And they're very harsh with him, and they tell him, you know, we're not happy with the way that you're behaving, and you need to be more open to ending the schism. So he gets his marching orders from his own council. Cividale del Friuli, there's not an awful lot to say about it. It says what you would expect. It says this is the real council and all other councils are not real councils. Gregory XII is the real pope and all other popes are not real popes. And all the successors of Urban are the real popes and all their cardinals are the real cardinals, etc., is what you would expect, okay? Because, yeah, oh, by the way, notice 3 popes, 3 colleges of cardinals. We've got 3 councils going on. It's, I suppose, a good thing in a way that Pisa is the one everybody seems to be behind. But what happens, 1409, so with Gregory XII's council, it kind of comes to a very abrupt end because one of I think the last Italian city that supports him, which is Venice, starts to waver because of the prestige of Pisa. They see who's shown up there and they're impressed. And then Venice switches sides and leaves the obedience of Gregory XII and goes over to Pisa. And he has to flee for his life. He escapes by sea. And I think the story is that he even kind of dresses one of his servants up as himself, and he pretends to be the servant just in case they get captured. He's been abandoned by more or less everybody at this point. Okay, on we go. So, this is what Philip Hughes says. The Pisan popes look much stronger than Gregory XII and Benedict XIII, but all this grandeur was of its nature transient, for it rested on nothing more enduring than the opinions of scholars and the goodwill of princes. Okay. The other thing is that the Council of Pisa made it very, very clear what they wanted from their pope, which is call another council. Okay? You have to call another council. There are problems that need generally sorting out at this point. The reform of Christian life, I mentioned before about, cardinals, never mind popes, living like their princes. Everybody more or less is in agreement that something has to be done about this. You need a general reform and a return to holiness and all that kind of thing. And also there are heresies which need dealing with. Wycliffe in England and Huss in Bohemia. And they don't want the new popes that they've elected, Alexander V, John XXIII, to kind of go mad and make things even worse. They've given the world a new pope, but they kind of want to keep a tight rein on him, so to speak. These popes have to really do the will of the council that elected them. So they have to call a new council within a few years. Now, John the 23rd tries to have it in Italy where he can kind of have political control of it, and it sort of doesn't work. One of the people who is supposed to be on his side turns against him. I forget exactly what happens. There's a whole lot of intrigue and back and forth, and in the end he ends up being, it's the emperor of the Germanies, Emperor Sigismund, who kind of twists his arm. And so the next council that is held is in Germany, but only just inside Germany. It's in Constance. So you have the Council of Constance following hard on the Council of Pisa. I think this is where we're going next. Okay. So the Council of Constance is 1414 to 1418. Here's Switzerland today, and this is Lake Constance. This is Germany. There's a sort of finger of land that sticks down into Lake Constance. That's where it is. Okay? It's practically in Switzerland, but it's in southern Germany. And Hughes says the history of the Council of Constance cannot ever be too closely studied. Right, I mentioned Acta Concilii Constantiensis, published by Finca in 1920. In fact, it was published between the 1890s and 1928. It's the Acts, the Acta, all of the kind of decisions, everything, all the debates, everything from the Council of Constance. It wasn't published until the start of the 20th century. So, in theory, one could read through it all and get a good idea. But it's fascinating because the Council of Constance, I think, is generally recognised by everybody as being a real council. And if you look at a list of councils in the history of the Catholic Church, Constance will be in there usually, and Pisa won't be. But who called the Council of Constance? John the 23rd, who was a Pisan pope. Who didn't call the Council of Constance either Benedict XIII or Gregory XII. Anyway, interesting, but we'll get to this. So next, right. It lasts 3.5 years, 45 sessions at the Council of Constance. It goes on and on and on. At its height, it's attended by 29 cardinals, 186 bishops, more than 100 abbots, 300 plus doctors of theology or law, and 11 kings or princes, and of course an emperor, the Emperor Sigismund. And it has 3 items on the agenda: the ending of the Western Schism, the suppression of new heresies and the reform of Christian life. Now, how much of a success is this Council of Constance? I think it's broadly a failure. Does it end the Western Schism? Yeah, pretty much. Does it suppress the new heresies? No. It burns Jan Hus at the stake, but it doesn't manage to suppress his heresy. In fact, things get really out of control because they defeat the Emperor Sigismund in battle, and it looks at one point as though the Hussites are going to spread their heresy all over Germany at one point. And the reform of Christian life, no. In fact, not only that, it puts an obstacle in the way of that without necessarily intending to. Okay, next, please. Council of Constance, yeah. So the ending of the Western Schism. This is the first item on the agenda. This is what happens. John the 23rd convenes the council, and he goes there with fear and trembling because he realises he's on somebody else's turf and he can't have his own way. Baldassare Cossa, by the way, is a fascinating character. I love all of these guys. He's one of my favourites. He's a larger than life character. He's in the politics, the money, you name it. He's very influential. I think at one point, when Alexander V is the Pisan Pope, he leads an army that goes and captures Rome. Gregory the 12th is still alive somewhere else, but he's not there anymore. And they capture Rome, but Alexander V doesn't get to see Rome because he dies. And then, of course, Baldassare Cossa becomes Pope himself. But there's this image of him leading troops into battle as a cardinal. His election at the Council of Pisa as John the 23rd, Hughes says, was John the 23rd's election vitiated by simony? And he says, basically, yeah, it was. So all sorts of money changed hands in him being elected Pope. That wasn't uncommon at the time. But this is what they mean by the reform of Christian life. You can't be having that going on. Also, the nepotism as well. Making your nephew a cardinal at the age of 18. You can't be doing that either, right? So John the 23rd, yeah, he arrives. Emperor Sigismund arrives not long after him. And then after that, after a little while, the representatives of Gregory the 12th, I think there's only two of them. I think he has one cardinal who's still loyal to him, who goes there as his kind of ambassador. And then they have to send people out to find Benedict the 13th and deal with him. Okay, so this happens in order. Do we have another slide, or do I need to talk about it on this slide? What's the next one? Right, let's stop there, stop. Okay, here we go. No, you can put all three of them on, but no further. Good, that's fine, thank you. Right, this is John the 23rd then. So he opens the Council of Constance, he convenes it, and he opens it in the name of the Holy Ghost and all the rest of it. And very quickly it becomes clear that they don't want him to be Pope or any of these guys to be Pope anymore. You've all got to resign, and we're going to have one Pope instead of all three of you. Which he's not happy about, as you can understand. But one of his supporters has a quiet word with him and says, look, if you try and hold out against them, you're just going to rub them up the wrong way. How about if you get ahead of this and offer to resign, and there'll be so much goodwill, they can be very generous towards you in return, and you'll look like the good guy. It's going to happen anyway. And he says, yes, okay, that's what I'll do. And so the Council of Constance is just getting ready to accept the resignation, the willing resignation of John the 23rd, when he changes his mind dramatically at the last minute and flees and escapes at night out of the city with one or two supporters, and he finds political sanctuary with, his name is, I think, Frederick, who is not even king, he's the Count of Tyrol in Austria, and which is it's not a very massive country that he's gone to with a huge army, but it's mountainous, and it's just going to be such a pain sending an army in there and getting him out and bringing him back. Do we really have to do this? And just as they're contemplating doing that, Frederick of Tyrol changes his mind and says, you know what, no, we can't be doing this. And he hands over Pope John the 23rd to the Council of Constance, who comes back, having tried to escape and failed, he comes back a broken man. And the Council Fathers are ready to kind of argue over every inch with him, and they find he just doesn't fight over any of it. He's a broken man. He just agrees to whatever they tell him. So he resigns. So that's the end of him. All right? There we go. Thank you. Gregory the 12th. I'm going to get the name wrong. It's either Malatesta or it's one of these other cardinals who's also a fascinating character. Turns up with sort of plenipotentiary powers to represent the Pope, and even resign in his name. But they're sticklers for legal form. By the way, canon law is the new thing in these days. So anyone who's anyone is into, just like the university is the new thing, canon law is the new thing. And you see a lot of these guys can be very legalistic about things, just like we saw with Benedict, with Pedro de Luna. So this cardinal says to the Council of Constance, I don't have the authority to confirm the Council of Constance because you met illegally, but I do have the authority to convene a council in the name of the true Pope. So to the assembled council fathers, this one cardinal representing Gregory XII goes up in front of them and goes through, in Latin, the formula of convening a council. They do this whole charade, but then technically, legally, from now on, the council that already exists in reality has been convened legally by Pope Gregory XII, and then this cardinal, on behalf of the Pope, resigns, abdicates the papacy. And the council fathers are very generous towards him because he's done it willingly and voluntarily. They give him a pension, and he's allowed to be a cardinal, and he's appointed bishop of I forget where. He dies, and he's buried not in Rome. I think I've got it on a map somewhere here. We'll see it in a moment. His tomb, and also the tomb of John the 23rd, who isn't buried in Rome either. He has a very elaborate tomb that the Medici paid for, I think. So he's now no longer the Pope. There we go. Right, there remains Pedro de Luna. And this causes no end of problem because they can't get him to resign. And also, Constance is in Germany and Pedro de Luna is where? He's in Spain. So they have to send ambassadors. And these guys have to go all the way across the Alps, across the bottom of France, across the Pyrenees. Well, to begin with, they don't have to go across the Pyrenees because he's in Perpignan. But in fact, the Emperor Sigismund goes in person to meet Benedict XIII and try to get him to resign. John the 23rd has resigned. Gregory XII has resigned. It's now your turn to resign. And they find the old man, and he is very old at this point, is just obdurate and subtle and full of clever arguments and twists and turns. And it's just infuriating. They can't make any headway against him. At one point he says, I agree, I will resign on condition that the new Pope has to be canonically elected, which sounds reasonable, right? But then they press him on exactly what does that mean, and he says, well, nobody's sure who the real cardinals are, so the only ones that anyone can really agree on is any cardinal still alive who was appointed by Gregory XI before this all began. Well, there is only one cardinal who's still alive. Have a guess who it is. Pedro de Luna. So what he really means when he says canonically elected is he means I'm the only one who gets to choose the new Pope. So they leave. They're completely frustrated, and after a while, that's it. They leave. And they're on their journey back east towards Constance. They get as far as Narbonne in southern France. And the King of Aragon and various representatives of other princes who are still with Benedict XIII overtake them and beg them, please don't go, to give it one more chance. And we promise you, if he still says no, we will go over to your side. So on those terms, they agree. So they turn around again and they head out west. Okay, next. That's the tomb of Gregory the 12th. And there we go.
Sorry.
Sant Flavianus. At various points it became a cathedral, but it's sort of a big church. It's in Recanati in Italy. He's buried there. I think that was where it's near Ancona. It's just below Ancona on the east coast. I think he ended up as bishop of that place. Right, next. Okay, that's their journey here. So there's Constance and there's Perpignan. 197 hours on foot according to Google Maps. Right? But that's with the good roads you have nowadays and tunnels to help you get across the Alps and everything. It would be a lot longer in those days. Yeah. And that's just one way. You've got to go back. But of course, they don't just go there and back. They go there, then they go back as far as Narbonne, which is sort of here, and then they go back again. Benedict XIII is no longer in Perpignan. He's now gone and retired to his family home, which is a castle at a place called Peníscola, which is right down into Spain. It's almost down in Valencia. But yeah, so we'll come to that in a moment. That he essentially he still says no, and so they say, well, we told you so. And then all of the cardinals, remaining bishops and whatnot from Benedict XIII, they all abandon him, and he's left with nobody as well, just like Gregory XII. And they all join the Council of Constance. They hammer out the agreement in the thing called the Treaty of Narbonne. Okay, you abandon Benedict XIII, we will allow you to sit as council fathers at Constance. Okay, that happens in 1416. Next. So that's Peníscola. That's the castle there. It's still there. That's the journey, and it's something like, I can't even read it myself. Can you read it?
613 hours.
How many miles?
1,666 miles.
Almost 1,700 miles. So if you wonder why this takes a while, these negotiations, that's why. And the council fathers at Constance, they send these ambassadors out, and then they just have to wait. They don't know what's going on. They just have to wait till they return, and it takes months, even years. If you visit, apparently, the castle, there's this bronze statue of him there. Notice he has a beard. Slightly unusual, but anyway, that's him. And I also included, this is a local tourist. I think this guy is fascinating. He lived for another 6 or 7 years after this in his castle. That's commemorating the 600th anniversary of his death from the local tourist board. Papa Luna, they call him. Pope Moon. You also notice on his coat of arms, it has a kind of upside down moon at the top. De Luna means moon in Spanish. And quite often the coats of arms, they have whatever the family name means is what the symbol is. Anyway, there we go. So, one last thing. Does anybody know whose coat of arms is this? I don't suppose you would recognise it. I wouldn't have done. It is. It's the University of St Andrews. Right. It's very interesting. That is Pedro de Luna's coat of arms at the top there. And apparently what happened was, in the days when England supported Urban VI, there were some scholars at Oxford and Cambridge who didn't want to support Urban VI. They thought Clement was the real pope, so they left and went up to Scotland, which was a kingdom friendly to their pope, and founded this university. So one of the byproducts of the Western Schism is the University of St Andrews. There we go, I didn't know that. So next. Okay, so there we go. 2 popes have resigned. One has been stripped of almost all his last remaining support. The heretic Jan Hus is condemned and executed. He's summoned and they ask him to answer for himself, and he just kind of makes things worse and worse and worse in trying to defend himself. People are not sure, is he really a heretic at the start? By the end, they're convinced this guy is a complete heretic, and he's burnt at the stake. Right. Reform, and then the election of a pope that everyone can recognise is what we need to do, and what order do we need to do it in? And the Council of Constance almost breaks up because of the fighting, because one half of them want to do reform first, and then we'll have a pope, and another one, the other half say we need the pope first, and then we'll do the business of reform. And of course, the fact that there's all this factional fighting convinces everybody, okay, we really need a pope first, and then we will do the business of reform. Okay, so in November 1417, there's a conclave in the city of Constance, and this pope really is recognised by pretty much everybody, and it brings to an end the Western Schism. Next. So there we go. There he is, Martin V, whose family name is Colonna. There's his coat of arms with a column on it. Yeah. Martin V and his successor, Eugene IV, are recognised by everybody, but their hands are kind of tied by the Council of Constance because of this decree frequens, which means you have to have councils regularly and they can hold the Pope to account. But the Western Schism is at an end. The question is, at what price? That's the real issue there. Okay, so 1417 next. Okay. So Pedro de Luna is still at large in Spain. He really doesn't have many supporters left, and Martin V is the one who just dominates Europe from then on. Okay, next. Okay, right, this is where I thought we'd get into a bit of the controversies, and I don't know. I'm, as far as possible, trying not to give my opinion about this, although if you want to boo and jeer and throw rotten fruit at me, please feel free. Were the Pisan popes real popes? Now, if you look up anything today, the answer is no, because Pisa wasn't a real council, they weren't real popes, and Gregory XII, common opinion has it, he was pope until 1415, till he resigned at Constance. However, you will all have heard of this pope, Rodrigo Borgia, on the eve of the Reformation, takes the name Alexander VI. Well, hold on a minute. Alexander V was one of the two Pisan popes. The last pope before that would have been Alexander IV. And in 1655, following the death of Innocent X, Fabio Chigi is elected and takes the name Alexander VII. That's in 1655. So this is 250 years after Pisa. Apparently, everybody still thinks that those Pisan popes are actually real popes. Okay? Next. Okay. Angelo Roncalli was elected in 1958. Some people would say he wasn't, but okay, whatever. Let's say for argument's sake that he was, and he takes the name John the 23rd. At which point the Annuario Pontifico had to be changed, because Baldassare Cossa was John the 23rd, so they rename him Antipope John the 23rd. This is Wikipedia, which is a completely secular atheist. I mean, these guys don't care. They're not Catholic. They don't know anything. But they're just saying factually here, Angelo Roncalli is elected and chose to reuse the ordinal 23, citing 22 other Johns of indisputable legitimacy. This is reflected in the modern editions of the Annuario Pontifico, which extend Gregory XII's reign to 1415. The Pisan popes, Alexander V and John the 23rd, are now considered to be antipopes. So apparently, it's a since 1958 thing that the Pisan popes are not popes. Apparently, before then, they were regarded as real popes. But that raises its own questions, because then, was the Council of Pisa a real council? Remember, it was the Council of Pisa that excommunicated and deposed and anathematized Pedro de Luna and, what was Gregory XII's name? Angelo Corrario. So you can't be elected pope unless there isn't a pope. Okay? So if John the 23rd, if Baldassare Cossa really was a pope, if he really was elected John the 23rd, that means there had to be no pope at the time. That means the Council of Pisa really did depose those two popes. So can cardinals get together and say, this guy's a heretic, we depose him? Does that work? I'm not saying that I know the answer to that, definitely one way or the other. I'm merely pointing out that it seems to be that people thought the answer was yes, at least up until 1958. Let's go on. Yeah. Does that make Pisa a real council? Okay. If Pisa wasn't a real council, then Gregory XII wasn't deposed in 1409, and you can't be elected pope if there's already a pope who's still alive. Okay, on we go. Okay, conciliarism, right. This is the sort of byproduct of the Council of Constance. They solve the Western Schism, but at the cost of really tying the hands of the popes for quite a while, at least the two after that, Martin V and Eugene IV, possibly even Nicholas V, right up into the mid-1400s. So the Decree Frequens of the Council of Constance says that another council has to be called within 5 years, and another one 7 years after that, and another one 10 years after that, and then every 10 years, which is what they do. But it also says, I mean, it's not quite as simple as saying council is superior to the Pope, but that is what it amounts to. It says the Pope can't dissolve the council against its own wishes. It says the Pope can't move the council to another city without the consent of the Council Fathers. There's all these other little things in there like that. So Martin V had supported this. His successor, Eugene IV, as they were both Council Fathers at Constance, these two popes. Martin V lives until, sorry, I should have said, he lives until well into the 1420s. I think he's the founder of the University of Louvain, Martin V, and Eugene IV is his immediate successor. But they both felt bound by the Council of Constance. They can't very well go against Constance, which had made them popes. But on the other hand, Constance tries to bind them to something that no pope can accept, really. Yeah, and in effect, councils can discipline popes if they're not happy with what they did since the last council. So it's turning the church into a kind of parliamentary democracy or kind of republic, or I don't know, something like that in practice. Right at a time where you needed a strong pope, because if you're going to reform Christian life and root out nepotism and all that kind of thing, and bribery and simony and luxurious living on the part of the cardinals, the only person who can do that is the pope, and he's going to need to be pretty hard-headed about banging heads together. He's going to have to take a lot of flack. But now you've just said that he has to answer to a cardinal, to a council made of cardinals every few years, who can fire him if they're not happy with him. So did you see the problem there? Right at the moment where you needed a pope to be really strong, on the eve of the Reformation, their hands are bound by this. Right, next. Okay, so these are the councils that follow then. Pavia in 1423 really doesn't get off the ground because the plague breaks out. So then it gets moved to Siena. The Council of Siena lasts for 1 year. Well, a bit less than a year, but 1423 to 1424. Not much to say about it because it really doesn't accomplish anything. And not many people show up either. Not many bishops, not many cardinals. Just no princes. People aren't really interested. That's the other thing. If you have regular councils, people get bored with councils and stop showing up to them, it turns out. Also, they spend the time talking about themselves. Siena talks about the authority of councils and so on. It's not very helpful, right? And that's followed a few years later by the Council of Basel. Now, the reason for two different dates is this one is moved. I think it's Eugene IV at this point. Says, okay, you guys have had long enough and you've kind of run out of things to talk about, so that's it now. We're now going to have the Council of Ferrara. And a lot of the Council Fathers go to Ferrara, but there are some of them that say, no, the Pope can't move a council. We have to agree to be moved. And so they stay in Basel. They stay there. So you have the Rump Council of Basel going on, and Ferrara is then moved to Florence. The Council of Florence takes place. This is the only one that really does accomplish something. You can read its decree about who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. Hint, anyone who's not a Catholic goes to hell, basically. But it goes into a huge amount of detail about exactly who all these different people are. Anyone at all who's outside the Catholic Church, you can't go to heaven, which of course is the teaching of the church and always has been, but they go into explicit detail concerning it. Also, the Council of Florence is where, at this point, the Muslims, the Turks, are really pressing hard against the Byzantines, and so the Greek Orthodox turn up and they're desperate for help, and they're actually willing to reunite. And in fact, they agree to reunite. They have all sorts of debates concerning the Filioque, and essentially the Roman side wins. They have debates concerning papal authority, and they sign this thing. The Greek Orthodox all come back into the church. The only problem is when they go home, they kind of shrink from announcing it to their own people because they know it won't go down that well, and there's a lot of real hatred for anything Roman Catholic in the east of the Mediterranean. And even though the Turks are literally at the gates of Constantinople, there are people going about saying, well, better the turban than the papal tiara. We'd rather be conquered by the Muslims than submit to the Pope. So that they are reconciled, but the people kind of don't follow them, and they are very reticent about admitting what they've done. So the reconciliation kind of doesn't stick. The Rump Council of Basel ends up electing its own pope, would you believe it? Yeah. So you couldn't make it up. He remains pope for about 10 years, and not only that, the guy that they elect is a layman, and in fact he's married and he has 4 children still alive. And he's well known for being a guy who cares about one thing only, which is money. So one of the advisors of the Pope, it's either Eugene IV or Nicholas V at this point, says to him essentially, just ignore them and just don't do anything and watch this Rump Council of Basel fall out with its own Pope. They'll all fall out with each other if you just leave them alone, which is exactly what happens. Next, I think he's the Duke of Savoy. Anyway, yeah. There we go. Yeah, sorry, yes. So they declare, it is Eugene IV who moves the Council of Basel, and those council fathers who don't want to go declare him deposed. Okay? But it's getting ridiculous at this point because there are not that many bishops, and it's all priests and canonists, theologians, and so on. Of the 12 bishops present, 7 are from Savoy. Maybe that gives us a clue as to why they elected Count of Savoy. I think it's Amadeus the 8th or something like that. They elect him Pope. Yeah. Only 1 cardinal is present among them, so they come up with a system of 33 electors chosen from the different nations, and they go into this conclave. And they elect Antipope Felix V. I think I've got a picture of him on the next slide. There he is. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, Cardinal Cesarini, whose name I've spelt wrong, advises Pope Eugene IV to take no action, wait for them to fall out with each other, which is exactly what happens. And eventually the Rump Council of Basel moves to Lausanne. I think actually Basel, the people of Basel and the mayor of Basel get a bit fed up with them. When are you guys going to leave? We've extended the hospitality of our city to you, and you're just not going anywhere. So they move to Lausanne, and then it kind of breaks up. They've got no more support at that point. And this chap here, Amadeus, Duke of Savoy, who's calling himself Pope Felix V, he kind of reconciles with the Pope, and the Pope is very generous to him in return and says, okay, you can be a cardinal and I'll appoint you to something, and also here's a generous pension for the rest of your life, which is the one thing that this chap really cares about. Mm-hmm. Joke's on him because he dies not long after that. Anyway, right, next. Okay, I had to include something about this chap here. Piccolomini, he issues the decree as Pius the second, execrabilis, which effectively reverses Frequens of Constance. It says, no, it's not councils, it's popes who are superior, and it's basically a heresy if you kind of want to go back to that way of doing things. He's another fascinating chap. He started out not even as a priest, he was secretary for all sorts of cardinals, and a big sort of Renaissance man, very much into learning and poetry and all that kind of thing. You notice his name, Enea Silvio. Enea is Aeneas in Italian, and Aeneas is the hero of the Aeneid by Virgil, which all of these classics had been sort of newly rediscovered. They were the new thing. They were all the rage among educated men. Some people think that he named himself Pius kind of as a bit of a joke. It's kind of in homage to Virgil, because in the Aeneid he's always described as Pius Aeneas. Yeah. When he was a layman and he was attached to various cardinals of their secretaries, he left bastard children in pretty much every city that he visited. At one point he got sent on a diplomatic mission on behalf of the Pope up to Scotland, and he writes about how absolutely barbaric it is up there, and he just heaves a sigh of relief when he gets back down as far as Newcastle, because he's in civilization again. Anyway, so that's him. Yeah. All right, next. That's it, I think. So yeah, this, I don't know. I suppose I'm going to throw it open and, well, I mean, if you want to ask questions, you can ask questions, or I would like to hear if anybody has an insight that I haven't thought of, can cardinals get together and depose a pope and say, this guy's a heretic, he's stubborn, he's disobedient, he's all the rest of it, he's no longer pope, and we're going to make a new one?
Well, I don't know for sure, but I certainly like to think they could.
Okay. The common opinion you see since then seems to be that they can't. But then the question is, if they can't, can all the cardinals, bishops and abbots, as we saw at Pisa and again at Constance, can they do it if they come together as a council? Not just the College of Cardinals, but the College of Cardinals and the bishops and everybody else.
By analogy, was there a mechanism for deposing a Roman emperor, or did you have to murder it?
Oh my goodness. No, I'm pretty sure you'd have to murder him. Does anybody know? Were there any Roman emperors who were deposed? I don't think so. I don't think so. And I think the first instance of a king being deposed, certainly in this country, was in 1399. Which king was deposed in England in 13? Richard II, and replaced by Henry IV. So the idea that you can kind of kick somebody out of office was a bit of a new idea as far as the kings were concerned there. Chesterton says that essentially that caused the Wars of the Roses because it created an image of an empty throne in everybody's mind where there hadn't been one before. So they're all kind of climbing the bloody steps to try and put themselves on the throne. But yeah. So which is more probable or reasonable, that a pope cease to be pope after a declaration or judgment by cardinals, bishops, etc., or that it just somehow happens, no one is sure exactly when, and whether anyone noticed or not. Now, this is what I'm driving at here. If there are people who say that, the last few popes haven't been popes, who deposed them? Well, no one, they deposed themselves. Let's say, for argument's sake, they're guilty of heresy. I think there's all sorts of heretical things that have come out of the mouths of plenty of recent popes. But who gets to say that he's not Pope anymore? My point is here, it was very controversial, and people are still not sure whether to accept the Council of Pisa deposing popes. And that's all of the cardinals together as a body, and most of the bishops, abbots, and so on. And if that's controversial, is it reasonable that we say, well, the Pope can just cease to be Pope whether anyone realises it or not, kind of thing, even though most people don't realise it? It seems to me that's a little bit of a stretch.
Well, in the time we're talking about, there had to be councils of work, this going on and on and on.
Yeah.
You got to work, well, let's just have to get rid of fight. And then with this, if you have got 2 or 3 posts already simultaneously, 2 of them have got to go.
Yes.
How'd you get rid of it?
I agree. That's the thing. Pisa and Constance did bring it to an end. They did. I mean, there's just no way around that. So if Pisa is an anti-council or a robber council or something, it's a robber council that actually accomplished something, which is a bit of an anomaly as well. Also, though, however, and I don't necessarily require any of you to answer this, but it's worth thinking about, as far as a pope losing office and being deposed, the very next thing that they do is they go and elect another pope. Now, there are some sedevacantists out there who get together and try and elect a pope, but vast majority of them don't do that. And it's always seemed to me that's sort of the logical thing to do, though, isn't it? If you are convinced there's no pope, well, then as a matter of urgency, we need there to be a pope. Now, you can say, well, there's no cardinals to elect him. Okay, that's a legalism. The law, remember, cardinals were only created at the end of the 1000s. There is a law that it's only cardinals that elect him, but a law only binds until it lapses. And if there are no more cardinals, then it's kind of de facto lapsed. You would think it devolves onto the next important people, right? The bishops. Well, there's no real bishops. Okay, what about the priests then? And so on, right? The fact that there's no real discussion of that, I don't know, and it may just be me being ignorant. What is the argument today, if you are a sedevacantist and convinced that there's no pope, what's the argument for why you don't try and elect a new one? Now, there's a couple of people, some of you know, who are pretty convinced sedevacantists. None of them appear to be here today, which is a shame because I was hoping we could have a bit of a discussion and a good old ding-dong fisticuffs and all the rest of it, throwing glasses at each other. I don't know the answer to that. It seems to me a little bit of an inconsistency. Yeah, yes.
Perhaps let's say the reason why they did all these extraordinary feats was because they had two popes who were generally celibate. And to create that situation, to show you what would happen if the celibate characters said, okay, we've now elected this guy, throws Europe back into that horrible hundreds of years that at the end of the day, everyone realized was a big test.
Yes, but from their point of view, at the moment there's no pope.
Yes,
And then they would have at least a pope. Do you see what I mean?
But it's had two popes.
Also, their guy would be traditional, and this other one is modernist, so it would be obvious to the world. I'm just trying to put myself in the mindset. Yeah.
Well, the argument that was within election the other pope. So if they realized they all made a big mistake,
Yes.
have one die.
Yes.
Can't just a group of men elect a new pope. Oh yeah, we believe that there was no pope who was still the next pope.
You would need to look at how it took place for the first 1,000 years in the church, where there weren't any cardinals. I think the clergy of Rome probably elected him, but I don't know. I'm not an expert on the different procedures and rules for this, but it's the same. I think you'll find it's the same with kind of how you canonize a saint. It changed over time. Initially, it was just everybody says so, and that'll do. Popular acclamation, and then it's kind of the bishops, and then finally it's reserved to Rome and so on, and then there's all these rules and regulations and hoops you have to jump through. Yeah. Or the other thing is, okay, so fine as far as an election, but notice the election happened at a council. Now again, suppose you're a sedevacantist alive today and you're convinced there hasn't been a real pope. By the way, this is another thing with modern sedevacantism, is you're not just being asked to believe that there's no pope, you're being asked to believe that there hasn't been one for almost 70 years, that there are no real cardinals, that there are no real bishops, because a bishop has to be appointed to a diocese by the pope. So is there some bishop in titular diocese in China who's alive at the age of 123, who was appointed by Pius XII? There's no real bishops left alive. So there's no way of getting a new pope, and there's no way of getting new cardinals and appointing new bishops. That's really what you're being asked to believe. That usually gets hidden in the background in the sedevacantist apologetic. That isn't brought into the fore. What you're asked to focus on is, isn't Francis awful? Which most people can agree on, he's pretty awful, right? And that's quite an easy sell. The hard sell is everything else, which kind of follows in its wake. Yeah.
If I may speak on their behalf.
Yeah.
So in the Council of Constance, I think, or what was the council where the Patriarch of Alexandria made that decree?
Pisa.
Pisa. In the Council of Pisa, it says that the Pope, the heretic, etc., and de facto is no longer the Pope. So they're not saying by our authority we're deposing him as Pope. They're saying by his own actions, he has himself.
Yes, but it requires them to say that. That is still their judgment, and this is the problem with saying something happens ipso facto. Who's to say whether it's happened ipso facto or not? Do you understand my point? There has to be an authority declaring this guy has put himself outside the church by his heresy. Yeah. Also, by the way, one little point, it was the Patriarch of Alexandria who read it out. It was all of the council fathers who signed it, basically. Yes, Lewis.
Victoria's point, hey, there was advocate. Surely a pope can be a heresy. Take Lord Honorius, for instance. Honorius was proclaimed a heresy by the Council of Constance. This is, I understand, a disputed point. As far as I'm concerned, it's black and white. It should Council of Gerd, I believe, to Honorius, post Gold Rome, the heretic.
Yep.
So we can talk here as given that Pope may be a heretic, may hold rest of issue.
Yep.
Rest opinions on issues, I shouldn't say. We surely say Francis or John Paul II will have used heresies. They will not automatically depose them from the papacy, which is what I think. Even if I'm putting words in mouth of Victorious, but here's what I think the argument Victorious made from this.
Okay, yeah. There's also another thing I meant to mention. if you're convinced there isn't a pope, why not first of all have a council? Because that's the first thing they did before they elected new popes. Before they declared there is no pope anymore, we've deposed him, was they actually got together in a council. But I mean, the other thing that's interesting, and I mentioned this in passing, is that it is a fairly modern phenomenon. Supposedly, I mean, according to most of these guys, there hasn't been a pope since 1958. Pius XII died in 1958. When was the first sedevacantist? When was the first priests running around teaching sedevacantism and so on? Does anybody know? I think it's well into the 70s, right? It's not immediately after Vatican II even. It's well into the 70s. So you're talking 15 or 20 years, and nobody noticed that we didn't have a pope, right? So during the entire reign of John the 23rd, everybody thought he was the pope and he wasn't, and there's literally not one person who realised the truth of the matter. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, personally, but...
So there's a big practical problem about council. We've got the last 5 stones. But the opposition has no cardinals.
Yes.
They have no bishops.
Yes.
The candidates have no cardinals. There's no support.
Well, nobody does except, yeah, well, exactly, yeah. This is, I don't know what the answer is myself, yeah.
Back in the time of the Schism, each side could possibly get a huge number of cardinals.
Right. Yes, no, I agree, and that's one of the many ways that it's, you can't really draw an analogy, you can't really draw a parallel with today. No, exactly. It's just not the same situation, is it?
Strike down your baby didn't have to like.
Yeah.
See what's the trouble.
Yeah. Yeah.
In what could you draw a parallel in that sense that in the way that they started to dislike Urban VI because he was just such a horrible character, and then they said he just can't be pope, we had to set up an election vote.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
In that same way, sedevacantists realized after 15, 17 years, this is such a horrible situation we're in, it can't be the pope, we have to have an absolution, and they come up with the sedevacantist solution. Yeah,
a little bit of being wise after the event, and it begs the question, well, why didn't you say something earlier? Yeah, I think so. It's also interesting, though, that the whole argument against Urban VI was he was never pope to begin with because the election was invalid. They didn't say, we, the College of Cardinals, hereby depose him. Now, why? Presumably they could have done. They said he wasn't the pope. Right, okay, but I mean, that then opens up the argument to, well, maybe the election was valid, maybe it wasn't, right? And the facts, unfortunately, when you finally get down to them, are not really in their favour. Versus, if they had declared him deposed, in the fashion of Pisa, and then elected Clement VII, I don't know, and I don't actually know what the thinking at the time was. Would people have accepted that? Would everybody have said, well, okay, the entire college together can depose a pope, so you can't argue with that? Or would they have said, what's this business of deposing popes? You can't do that. I don't know. I don't know. My point is, if it was so obvious to everybody that cardinals can just get together and depose the boss, kick him out, why didn't they do that? The fact that they didn't do it, to my mind, suggests that either it didn't occur to them, or if it did, they knew it wouldn't necessarily have been accepted. So either way, it suggests that that's not really a thing. Does that sort of make sense?
Or that perhaps they thought it would took us the wisely. They got the tide.
Well, the joke's on them if so, because look how much trouble what it caused in the end, saying that the election was voided.
Could be worse. They're two bad folks.
Yes. I mean, they were both pretty bad. Somebody reminded me, I forgot to mention this on the way through. Urban VI, when I say he was a monster, there's a bit in Hughes where he tells about how they got on a boat. He got on with 3 cardinals at one end to sail from one part of Italy to the other. 3 cardinals got on with him and 1 got off at the other side. And whenever anyone asked him afterwards what happened to them, he said, I don't know, they can't be found. Who knows where they are? And Hughes says pretty certainly he had them thrown overboard. So he was a man who murdered his own cardinals if he felt like it. He was a monster, yeah. And Clement VII, Benedict XIII, they weren't great either. Benedict XIII, Pedro de Luna, did have one thing in his favour, in that he was kind of a man of austere morals. He had a very long papacy. I think by the time Sigismund came to treat with him on behalf of the Council of Constance, he'd been pope for 21 years. No simony, no nepotism. He was, again, ironically, he was probably the best pope of all of that period in that regard, and he wasn't even pope.
I think, unless anyone else has anything pertinent to say, of course you can continue conversation in private, but we'll call it there.
Yep. Okay, all right, thank you.